Hi, and welcome to this special episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics, where we consider how what's past is prologue. In this episode of Life's Lessons from History, we're going to be considering what we ought to think of first. In other words, what is it, this above all? Hi, I'm Ann Lloyd, and welcome to this episode of What's Past is Prologue. To start off the new year, I thought we'd start with a fairly famous quotation of Shakespeare's, "And this above all, to thine own self be true." I've heard this said in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of situations, but I want you to consider what is happening in the play itself. This is from Hamlet, in particular, who's saying this line that has gone down in history and lasted through generation after generation. It's Polonius. And if you think about Polonius in the Shakespeare canon, and in Hamlet in particular, is that someone you want to be going to for life advice? This above all, this is the very most important thing. To thine own self be true. What Polonius is doing is giving quite a bit of advice to his son Laertes as Laertes leaves and goes off to college and new adventures. So it is the attempt of a parent to give good counsel to the son. And on that level, being true to yourself, which we might want to think about as meaning know your values. What is it you value most? Be true to that authentic version of yourself. Is that true of Polonius? Let's think about that for a minute. If we look at what we know about Polonius from the play, we see that Polonius really seems to value being right in the center of that powerful court. Whoever is in charge, whoever is the king. There's been a change recently from old King Hamlet to Claudius, but Polonius still seems to be at the heart of court with a whole lot of contacts. He seems to be someone people turn to when they have questions or when they need something done, maybe not necessarily something wonderful done. And it turns out that Polonius continues to insert himself into the discussion where Gertrude and Claudius are concerned about young Hamlet, who is so out of sorts and unhappy about the death of his father, the marriage of his mother and the brother of his father, and the new regime that has taken the throne. Hamlet is not on board. And Polonius kind of gets himself in the middle of that, takes his daughter Ophelia. She's already involved, but he starts manipulating her. He does seem to be consistently being true to himself. If we're right, and his value is being at the heart of that court and involved with access to power. Now, what often happens when that is your value, that is your true above all to myself and my access to power, as Polonius might think, doesn't always end well. And we know that Polonius does manage to get himself to the center of things. In fact, he has a front row seat to all kinds of things, including Hamlet's discussion with his mother when Polonius is hiding behind the arras and Hamlet cries, "A rat, a rat," and stabs Polonius. So he doesn't end well. Pretty violent, pretty uncomfortable. He's dragged out, and the last thing we really hear about him is when Hamlet explains that you'll nose him by the stairs. In other words, his body's starting to stink. Okay, what about other characters in the play? Do we see other characters clarifying their values and being true to themselves? I think Hamlet actually has a little trouble with this. When we meet Hamlet, he is very upset about the death of his father. and pretty vulnerable to this idea that his friends and some of the guard have seen the ghost of the old king. And Hamlet is determined to hear what the ghost has to say. And unfortunately for Hamlet, for Ophelia, for Laertes, for Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and all kinds of people, what the ghost has to say is that, yes, he was murdered, and that Hamlet should revenge his most foul and unnatural murder. After all, this is a revenge play. But that idea of acting on the instinct to revenge a father's murder doesn't seem to fully align with Hamlet's values. He hesitates. He stops himself when he comes upon the king and the king is at prayer, even though if you listen to the king is unable to pray because the murder of his brother is weighing heavily on him. Even so, Hamlet sees him in that posture and decides, well, I don't want to kill him while he's praying because then his soul might go to heaven. And I certainly don't want to send his soul to heaven. So he kind of finds an excuse. I'll do it later. He puts it off. Then he decides he really needs to figure out if he got it right, if for sure the king killed Hamlet's father. So he decides the play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of a king. And he has the players come and act out a known play, The Murder of Gonzago, but with special lines Hamlet has inserted. And the reaction he gets from Claudius lets him know, yes, indeed, this is it. He really did it. He's acting guilty. And Hamlet still doesn't act immediately. In fact, there are many deaths, Polonius, Ophelia, that occur, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, that occur before that final scene where many people again die before Hamlet finally kills the king, kills Claudius. And in doing so, he has not only accidentally killed Polonius, really caused the death of Ophelia, certainly caused the death, sort of in self-defense, of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, caused the death of Laertes. He has caused a lot of death and chaos in the kingdom, and pretty soon here comes Fortinbras to take over the kingdom. So on a family level, on a national and international level, it's terrible. Things have fallen apart, and there are a number of reasons for that. But I do think part of that is that Hamlet does not follow that advice. He is not true to himself and his values. He values life, he values conscience, and the more he works against that, the longer he takes to kill Claudius and the more deaths he causes. So does that mean it's bad advice? Not necessarily. And now that we've looked at some sort of not so great example, I want to tell you about a couple of wonderful examples of women in history who that phrase really seems to fit. This above all, to thine own self be true. They lived long before Shakespeare, so he was not writing about them. But I think their lives are a great example. They're not easy. They don't necessarily end in the most comfortable or wonderful ways. But those women are true to themselves. And who are they? Katherine of Aragon and Mary I, a mother and daughter combo from Tudor history. And I know the most famous mother-daughter combo, Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I. And you know, I love me some Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I. But in this case, I really think that Katherine of Aragon and Mary are great examples of women who know themselves, who know their best selves, who know their values and are true to them. Katherine of Aragon comes to England as a young woman. She has been prepared to be a royal consort, to be the queen consort of England. So she marries Prince Arthur, who is going to, we think at the time, grow up and be King of England, and she will be his queen. Now, everything seems to go well. Her behavior, her looks, her demeanor are all praised by the English when they are writing to Spain to Catherine's parents. And Catherine and Prince Arthur head off, and tragically, within 6 months, Arthur has died. Catherine becomes ill, but does get better. And Catherine comes back to the English court, now a widow. While her father and her former father-in-law wrangle for 7 years over Catherine's dowry and what she's going to do next, whether or not she will marry young Prince Henry, even possibly truthfully, maybe he was just playing around. Henry VII, after his wife Elizabeth of York died, possibly considered marrying Catherine himself. No, didn't happen, but that was sort of floated. How did Catherine behave during that time? Again, above reproach. She was frustrated, but she went so far as to sell her clothing, sell her royal plate so that she could pay her servants. She was appointed by her father to be the ambassador, the first female ambassador from the court of Spain to the court of England, and she carried that out with dignity and style. She made such a great impression on the English people that they adored her, despite their not necessarily liking everyone that came over from Spain. And young Prince Henry was smitten. And when Henry VII died and young Prince Henry became Henry VIII, one of his absolute first acts was to choose to marry, despite there being some negotiations in another direction, he chose to marry Katherine of Aragon. And Katherine of Aragon was an exemplary consort for Henry VIII. We all know that there was one thing she was unable to do, which may have been his fault, but let's not go there. But in every other way, she was a lovely and charming hostess. She was very well educated and was able to, with him, greet all of the foreign ambassadors and visitors. She represented him brilliantly. In fact, he trusted her so much that when he went off, he thought to conquer France, he left Catherine in charge, despite the fact there was a war going on with Scotland. And Catherine rode up to the border and rallied the troops herself and helped inspire the English victory. And then she took the coat of the dead king that was all bloody, and she sent it to Henry VIII over in France, partly as a trophy. Look what I've done. And also as an encouragement, you do the same. Henry VIII, not quite as successful as Catherine had been. But in any case, Catherine was exemplary. And even when Henry, frustrated by the lack of a male heir, turns against Catherine, tries to set her aside, tries to coerce, and then bully, and then pressure using every means possible, tries to do all these things to get her to agree to an annulment, to agree that their marriage wasn't valid, to admit that she really had slept with Prince Arthur and that that marriage had been consummated, was therefore valid. So the marriage to Henry VIII was not. Catherine, above all, was true to herself and what she knew to be true, to her values, to her destiny that she believed in 100%. And despite everything Henry VIII did to humiliate her, despite the way he showed off Anne Boleyn as his clear favorite, despite declaring his own marriage invalid, and in fact, having Anne Boleyn in a huge ceremony crowned Queen of England, Catherine never stopped seeing herself as what she believed was her true self. Her value was that clear to her. She never wavered. And her commitment to her role as the Queen of England was so strong that in her last letter to Henry VIII, she is gracious, she is loving, and in the final line, she declares that above anything else, her eyes desire the sight of him. She never wavers from who she was, her most authentic self and her highest values. And she taught that belief in self, that commitment to the highest value of yourself to her daughter, Mary. Now, Mary had a difficult time after the death of her mother. It was devastating. And Mary was not allowed to see her mother as Catherine became sick and as she passed away. So Mary is left. And when Catherine dies in January of 1536, Mary sees what's happening because Anne Boleyn's not having a great year either. Anne Boleyn has a miscarriage. Things continue to be rocky and worse. And in May of 1536, Anne Boleyn is executed. She is gone. And Mary believed that everything Henry had done wrong, breaking with the church, sending her mother away, was because of Anne Boleyn. And a lot of people thought that. A lot of people believed Henry VIII would just swing right back into the arms of Rome now that Anne Boleyn was gone, now that the problem's gone. That's not what happened. In fact, the push, the bullying, the pressure on Mary to accept her father as supreme head of the Church of England, something Mary didn't accept, to accept that her parents were not married, that's not how Mary saw things, that got greater and greater after Anne Boleyn was gone. Mary was really on her own, and she had to live by her wits, which she did. In some ways, she did accept her father's new version of religion. She accepted Jane Seymour. She'd not accepted Anne Boleyn, but now that Katherine of Aragon had died, she accepted Jane Seymour. She certainly accepted Edward as the heir to the throne. When Henry VIII died and Edward became Edward VI of England, he tried to push the English church further and further and further into reform. And he expected his half-sister Mary to come along. She would not. She refused. She insisted that part of her value, that part of who she was not going to bend to her brother's will, even if he was the king. And by the way, because he was still a minor, she believed he didn't have the right to change the law, and she was willing to adhere to the Church of Henry VIII, but not all of the reforms that Edward was enforcing. Edward, as his reign went on and things were very difficult with his sister Mary, decided it really would be better not to leave the throne to her. And in the final year of his reign, he has not been a sickly child his whole life, but he does become sick at the end. Seems to have gotten measles and he didn't quite recover and was then vulnerable to other diseases. So as 1553 kind of marches along, Edward realizes that if he's going to not leave the throne to Mary, as the parliamentary law says, he's going to have to do something. So he creates what he calls his device for the succession that names Lady Jane Grey as his heir. Now, people realize that Lady Jane Grey had a very short reign, if you even think she was queen at all, and some people don't. In any case, we know from our perspective that Mary ends up succeeding. But at that time, I want you to imagine what it was like. Everyone, when Edward announced his device, when Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen of England, when she was installed in the Tower, not the scary prison, but the royal household, that royal palace. And she had access to the arms and the soldiers and everything. The Privy Council was there on her side. Everyone, with one important exception, believed Jane would be the Queen of England. Certainly Mary's relatives in Spain, who have been supporting her all this time and warning Edward not to be too mean to her, their direction to their ambassadors was to make inroads with Queen Jane and simply assure that Mary would be safe. Not to demand that Mary be installed as queen, but just to make sure she was safe. Across Europe, people expected Jane Grey to be the Queen of England. But that one person who didn't, Mary herself. Mary believed above all that her own self, her value, what she was destined to be, was the Queen of England. Her mother had taught her that she, as the daughter of Henry VIII and Katherine of Aragon, two royal households combined in Mary, had more right than anyone else to be queen. And years after she lost her mother, Mary acted on that belief. She didn't give up. She didn't give in. She knew her value and she held on to it. This, above all, Mary might have said, to myself, my destiny, my God-given path, I will be true. So Mary managed to rally people to her side. Now, the people of England, honestly, were much more familiar with Mary, whom they had loved since she was a baby princess, than they were with Jane Grey. It wasn't that they had anything personal against Lady Jane Grey, but she wasn't who they were expecting. Henry VIII had said in his Third Succession Act, Edward and all of his heirs, and then Mary. So that's what they were expecting. But it took Mary saying, hey, it's me, and putting herself out there, riding out at the head of her followers. And then pretty soon the Navy comes around, and pretty soon the other nobles come around. And by the time Mary rides to approach London, she is proclaimed queen. But what did she do? Days. Now we know Jane Grey's reign only lasted days. But Mary had proclaimed herself queen right from the start. And now everyone else went along with it. I believe that Katherine of Aragon and Mary I are the perfect examples of what happens when you take that advice from Polonius, given hundreds of years later by Shakespeare, but take that idea. This above all, to thine own self be true. Neither Mary nor Katherine had things go their way all the time. In fact, they were both treated badly by Henry VIII, by Edward and Dudley and some other people. They were both treated badly. Their lives were in danger. They were told they were less than. But both Katherine and Mary were able to know their values clearly enough to know what mattered most to them, to believe in the best versions of themselves and their destiny, that they were able to rise above whatever was happening around them. And I think they both should be remembered in that way, and that we can learn a great deal. Perhaps Polonius is not the greatest example, I would say, certainly. Hamlet is not the greatest example, but those words from Hamlet give us a good way, I think, to start the year. This above all, to thine own self be true. What are your values? Do you know what matters most to you, to your family, as a leader? Whether you are a leader of an organization, whether you are a leader of a team within an organization, or perhaps a sports team, If you were a leader of a community, you are a leader of your family. If you are simply striving to be a better personal leader of yourself and your own life, to take more control for making things better for you and the people you care most about. I think one of the ways that history shows us what's possible is these two women, Katherine of Aragon and Mary the First, who knew their value despite what anybody else said, who knew what could be achieved, and above all, were true to their best selves and what they believed they had to offer. I think we can learn from them. As I always say, history shows us what's possible, that whatever is going on around us, and we have some challenges right now, still, when we know our values and what matters most, we can take responsibility for who we are, how we show up in the world, what we do and say, the way we treat people, the way we lead ourselves and others, the way that Katherine and Mary did. And we too can be successful as we strive to become better leaders. Thank you so much for joining me for this special episode of What's Past is Prologue, as we look at all the ways that history shows us what's possible. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me for this special episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I would really appreciate it if you'd share with a friend, maybe leave a rating. Let me hear from you what you think. And please join me again as we look at all the ways that history shows us what's possible. Thank you.